London, 1847. The social season promised to be the most brilliant that London had witnessed in years. The ballrooms glittered with crystal chandeliers, ladies displayed their most luxurious gowns, and gentlemen wore their finest tailcoats. Among all that magnificence, a young woman of 23 stepped for the first time into the grand ballroom of the Marquis of Ashford's residence, feeling her heart beat in a frenetic rhythm that had nothing to do with the orchestra's music. Andrea Whitmore, known affectionately as Andy by those closest to her, had grown up hearing stories of dazzling balls, of fortuitous encounters that changed destinies, of gazes that crossed entire rooms to find a soulmate. Daughter of a baron of modest means but respectable lineage, she had nurtured throughout her youth the dream of one day finding her match, marrying for love, and building a family where genuine affection would be the strongest foundation, stronger than any fortune or title. Her brown eyes shone with that romantic expectation that only hearts not yet touched by disillusionment could keep burning. The celestial blue silk dress she wore that evening had been carefully chosen by her mother, Lady Margaret Whitmore, a woman of firm principles and an attentive eye to the movements of high society. The fabric flowed gracefully around Andy's slender body, enhancing her delicate silhouette without ever crossing the line of impropriety. Her dark brown hair had been styled in an elegant arrangement, with small white flowers intertwined that lent an air of spring innocence to her appearance. When the orchestra began a new waltz, Andy watched the dancing couples with barely disguised admiration. It was then that she felt it, even before turning her head, even before identifying the source of that overwhelming sensation, she knew she was being watched. Heat rose up her neck, tinging her cheeks with a delicate blush, and when she finally allowed her eyes to survey the room in search of that burning gaze, she found it. Edward Ashford, the Duke of Ravenswood, stood near one of the marble columns, a champagne glass forgotten in his hand, completely motionless as he fixed her with an intensity that should have been forbidden in polite society. He was everything young ladies whispered about in private circles and everything mothers warned about with severity. Tall, with broad shoulders that magnificently filled his dark tailcoat, raven black hair that contrasted with eyes of stormy grey, Edward possessed that masculine and dangerous beauty that made hearts race and reputations be forgotten, but it was not just his appearance that made him legendary in aristocratic circles. Edward Ashford had built his reputation on foundations of strength and determination. At 30 years old, he commanded his vast properties with a firm hand, participated actively in the House of Lords, where his opinions were respected even by political adversaries, and maintained a posture that oscillated between impeccable chivalry and an impetuosity that suggested dormant volcanoes beneath snow-covered mountains. They said that when the Duke of Ravenswood decided something, not even the Queen herself could dissuade him. In that moment, as his eyes remained locked on Andy's across the crowd, something changed in his habitually controlled expression. It was as if a door locked for years finally opened, allowing an unknown light to flood dark chambers. He deposited the glass on a passing tray, never averting his gaze, and began crossing the room toward her with deliberate steps that made the crowd instinctively open a path. Andy felt unable to breathe properly. Her hands sought the fan attached to her wrist in an attempt to anchor herself to reality, but her fingers trembled slightly. Something primitive and frightening awakened in her chest, a sensation that her romantic readings had never managed to describe with precision. It was as if her body recognized something that her mind still struggled to comprehend. But before Edward could reach her, a soft and melodious voice sounded at her side, interrupting the trance. "Forgive my boldness, miss, but it would be a crime against the beauty of this music to allow you to remain without a partner for the next waltz." Andy turned abruptly and found herself before another gentleman, this one with an appearance that contrasted dramatically with the Duke's somber intensity. Alberto Sinclair was the personification of aristocratic joviality. Where Edward commanded attention through intensity and power, Alberto drew people in through warmth and genuine interest. It was said in society that Alberto Sinclair had never met a stranger, only friends he had not yet gotten to know. His reputation was spotless, his kindness legendary among both servants and peers alike. While other young aristocrats spent their evenings gambling and drinking to excess, Alberto was known for his charitable work with orphanages and his genuine interest in improving conditions for workers on his family's estates. Carefully combed blonde hair, eyes of crystalline blue that always seemed to be smiling, delicate but distinctly masculine features that recalled Greek sculptures in museums. He bowed with fluid grace, extending his gloved hand in an invitation impossible to refuse without causing offense. "Alberto Sinclair, son of the Earl of Pemberton, entirely at your disposal." There was something in Alberto's smile that melted reservations. It was not the voracious flame that Edward provoked, but rather the sunlight after a storm, warm and comforting. Andy found herself smiling back, accepting his hand almost without realizing she was doing so. "Andrea Whitmore, Mr. Sinclair." "It will be an honor." As Alberto led her to the center of the ballroom, Andy caught a glimpse of Edward's expression. The Duke had stopped a few meters away, and something dangerous crossed his aristocratic features. His eyes narrowed slightly, his jaw tensed almost imperceptibly, and his hands briefly closed before relaxing again. It was only a moment, but enough for Andy to perceive that something significant had just happened. What she did not know, what no one in that ballroom except two men knew, was that she had just inadvertently positioned herself at the center of a friendship dating back 25 years. Edward Ashford and Alberto Sinclair had been friends since childhood. Their families owned neighboring properties, and the boys grew up riding through the same fields, studying with the same tutors, sharing dreams and adventures with the complicity that only carefree youth allows. When Edward was sent to Eton, he insisted that Alberto accompany him. When Alberto suffered a hunting accident at 17 and spent months recovering from a broken leg, it was Edward who remained by his side, reading to him, playing endless chess games, ensuring that loneliness did not consume his naturally cheerful spirit. Their personalities were complementary opposites. Where Edward was intense and tempestuous, Alberto was gentle and diplomatic. Where Edward commanded with unquestionable authority, Alberto persuaded with irresistible charm. Together, they formed a formidable duo in social and political circles. More importantly, they trusted each other with absolute loyalty that had never been tested by anything significant, until that night. As Alberto guided Andy through the waltz with impressive mastery, conversing pleasantries that made her laugh with genuine ease, Edward observed from the periphery of the room with an increasingly somber expression. He recognized that smile on Alberto's face, the lightness in his movements, the particular brightness in his eyes. He knew his friend too well not to notice. Alberto was not simply being courteous with an available young lady. He was enchanted, and Edward, for the first time in his carefully controlled life, tasted the bitter flavor of jealousy burning his throat. What made it worse was that Edward could not even fault Alberto's approach. His friend was being exactly himself, genuine and warm, making Andy laugh with stories about his misadventures in the countryside, asking about her interests with real curiosity. Edward watched as Andy's face lit up when Alberto asked about her favorite books, saw her lean in slightly when Alberto described a particularly beautiful sunset he had witnessed on his family's estate. It was natural, effortless, the kind of connection that looked easy because it was. Edward's own approach had been intense, almost aggressive in its directness. He had looked at Andy and felt something fundamental shift inside him, a recognition that bypassed all rational thought. But Alberto's method was different, no less effective. He was building bridges, creating comfort, making Andy feel safe and valued. And Edward, standing there watching them, realized that his friend might actually win her heart simply by being kind. The waltz ended to polite applause, and Andy made a graceful curtsy to Alberto, still smiling in that way that made her entire face illuminate. It was then that she felt a presence behind her, so close she could perceive the subtle aroma of sandalwood and something indefinably masculine. "Miss Whitmore." Edward's voice was deep, laden with something that made every nerve ending in Andy's body awaken. "Would you grant me the honor of the next dance?" It was not exactly a request. The tone carried that habitual authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed, but there was also an underlying urgency that transformed the words into something more significant than a simple invitation to dance. Andy turned slowly, finding herself incredibly close to the Duke. Up close, he was even more impressive. Taller than she had imagined, with sculpted features that recalled medieval warlords about whose histories she had read in ancient books. But it was his eyes that held her, that stormy grey that seemed to see directly through all her carefully constructed defences. It would be an honour, Your Grace." Edward's hand enveloped hers firmly, and Andy felt an electric current course through her arm. He led her back to the centre of the ballroom exactly as the orchestra began another waltz, and when his hand encircled her waist, appropriately placed but somehow seeming to burn through the layers of fabric, Andy had the strange sensation that her life had just changed irrevocably. Dancing with Edward was completely different from dancing with Alberto. Where Alberto had been light and entertaining, Edward was intense and dominant. He guided her with absolute confidence, his movements precise and powerful, keeping her as close as decency permitted and perhaps a centimetre beyond. His eyes never left hers, creating a bubble of intimacy that seemed to exclude the hundreds of people around them. "Have you known each other for a long time?" Andy heard herself asking, in a desperate attempt to break the suffocating intensity. "Alberto and I? Since we have memory." Edward's response came accompanied by an expression Andy could not completely decipher. "He is more than a friend. He is a brother in everything except blood." There was something in the way he said, that which made Andy perceive layers of meaning that her inexperience could not fully process. Before she could respond, Edward continued, his voice lowering until it became almost a whisper. "But there are things, Miss Whitmore, that test even the most solid friendships. There are moments when a man discovers there are limits to what he is willing to share." Andy felt the blush intensify on her cheeks. She was not naive enough not to understand that she was being courted, that those words carried implications far beyond polite conversation, but the intensity was overwhelming, especially coming from a man she had met mere minutes ago. "Your Grace is very direct," she managed to say, maintaining a light tone despite her racing heart. "And you are too beautiful for me to waste time with unnecessary circumlocutions," Edward responded with brutal frankness. "Life has taught me that decisive moments do not wait for social conveniences." The waltz came to an end, but Edward held her a moment longer than appropriate before releasing her waist. When he finally led her back to where her mother watched with an increasingly alarmed expression, Alberto waited there, a smile still on his lips, but something different in his eyes when he looked at Edward. "Ravenswood," Alberto greeted with familiarity. "I see you have finally met Miss Whitmore. Remarkable, don't you think?" "Remarkable would be an insufficient term," Edward replied without taking his eyes off Andy. The tension between the two men was palpable, an electric current that made the air seem heavier. Other guests began to notice, discreet whispers beginning to circulate like invisible waves through the ballroom. Lady Margaret Whitmore, whose maternal and social instincts were highly attuned, decided it was time to intervene. "Andrea, dear," her voice cut through the charged moment with surgical efficiency, "I am beginning to feel a slight headache. Perhaps it would be prudent for us to retire." Andy recognized this for what it was, a strategic exit to preserve reputations before the situation became the object of harmful gossip. What two of society's most prominent gentlemen, doing what appeared to be a silent duel for her attention, would certainly feed malicious tongues for weeks. "Naturally, Mother," Andy responded, relieved and disappointed in equal proportions. Edward and Alberto made their bows, but not before Andy captured the exchange of glances between them. It was something complex, loaded with shared history, and a new tension that neither seemed to know how to process adequately. During the carriage ride back to their more modest residence in Mayfair, Lady Margaret maintained deliberate silence until they were a few blocks from home. Then, with that tone she used when she needed to say uncomfortable truths, she began, "Andrea, I need you to understand the gravity of what I witnessed tonight." Andy turned to her mother, genuine confusion on her face. "I do not understand, Mother. I danced only 2 waltzes, with the 2 best friends of high society, who appeared to be waging a silent battle over who would have the privilege of your next dance." Lady Margaret sighed, removing her gloves meticulously. "The Duke of Ravenswood and Mr. Sinclair are known for their unwavering loyalty to each other. To see that tension between them, and you at the center, will create speculations that could affect your reputation. But I did nothing improper. I am not saying you did, dear. I am saying that society rarely concerns itself with the truth when there is a more interesting story available. She reached for her daughter's hand, squeezing it gently. Both are excellent matches, the Duke even more so naturally given his position. But if a public competition begins between them, she did not need to finish the sentence. Andy understood perfectly. A young lady at the center of a dispute between two gentlemen could be seen as manipulative or, worse still, as a calculated scheme to elevate her social position through scandal. But that night, lying in her bed with moonlight entering through the lace curtains, Andy could not think about reputations or social strategies. Her mind insisted on revisiting two pairs of eyes, one stormy grey and one crystalline blue, both looking at her as if she was something precious and irreplaceable. What she did not know was that, a few kilometers away in the imposing mansion of Ravenswood House, two men shared brandy in a mahogany-lined library, trapped in a tense silence that was completely unprecedented in decades of friendship. It was Alberto who finally spoke, slowly turning his glass between his fingers. "She is extraordinary, don't you think?" Edward remained still by the window, observing London's dark streets. "She is. I intend to court her," Alberto said, his tone still casual but with an underlying firmness. "With all propriety, naturally. I believe she would be a perfect companion." Edward closed his eyes briefly, a sharp pain crossing his chest. "Alberto, I know you felt it too, old friend," Alberto interrupted gently. "I am not blind. I saw the way you looked at her, but we need to be reasonable about this." Edward finally turned, his face a mask of control with visible cracks. "Reasonable? How exactly do you suggest we be reasonable when we have both just met the woman who could be—" He did not finish, but he did not need to. Alberto understood perfectly. "So what do you propose?" Alberto asked, putting his glass aside and standing up. "That we fight for her like savages, that we destroy a 25-year friendship over a woman we met a few hours ago." "I am not suggesting we fight," Edward replied, each word heavy. "I am saying I cannot simply step aside. Not this time. Not with her." Alberto studied his friend's face, seeing there a vulnerability that Edward rarely allowed others to witness. He sighed deeply. "Then we will both court her. Honorably, respectfully, and let her choose." He extended his hand. "But promise me, Edward, that regardless of the outcome, our friendship will survive." Edward looked at the extended hand for a long moment before gripping it firmly. "I promise. But Alberto, you need to understand. I will fight for her with everything I have." "I would expect nothing less," Alberto replied with a smile that did not quite reach his eyes. The following days transformed into a delicate social dance that kept half of London in fascinated suspense. Flowers arrived daily at the Whitmore residence, dramatic red roses from Edward alternating with delicate white lilies from Alberto, invitations for park walks, for opera performances, for art exhibitions arrived in pairs, each gentleman apparently determined to surpass the other in attention and creativity. Andy found herself in an extraordinarily uncomfortable position. She genuinely appreciated both men, though in completely different ways. Alberto was easy, comforting, the kind of company that transformed even the most mundane tasks into fun adventures. He made her laugh with clever anecdotes, discussed books with genuine enthusiasm, and treated her with a kindness that warmed her heart. Edward, on the other hand, was intense and challenging. Their conversations explored deeper territories, philosophy and politics and dreams that were rarely verbalized in polite society. He looked at her as if he were trying to memorize every detail of her face, as if she were a fascinating puzzle he was determined to decipher. With Edward, Andy felt alive in a way that was simultaneously exciting and terrifying. A month after the initial ball, the three found themselves at a private musical performance at the residence of the Marquis of Hertford. The room was packed with London's aristocracy, but Andy felt the moment when both men entered, an acute awareness that seemed to have developed with time. The tension between Edward and Alberto had become more visible with each passing week. Where once they had been inseparable at social events, Now they carefully maintained distance, speaking to each other with excessive politeness that fooled no one. Their friends noticed, servants whispered, and the mothers of other eligible daughters watched with a mixture of sympathy and schadenfreude, glad their own daughters were not the cause of such discord. During the intermission, as guests circulated with champagne glasses and conversed in groups, Andy found herself briefly alone on a less frequented terrace, seeking a moment of respite from the constant attention. She pressed her gloved hands against the cool stone balustrade, breathing deeply of the evening air, trying to calm the anxiety that had been building in her chest for weeks. She had noticed the change in both men. Edouard had become more brooding, his intensity shading into something darker. He looked at her with a possessiveness that was both thrilling and frightening. Alberto, meanwhile, had lost some of his characteristic lightness. His smiles did not reach his eyes quite as fully, and she had caught him staring at Edouard with an expression of profound sadness more than once. She was hurting them both, she realized. Her inability to choose, her selfish desire to hold on to both connections, was damaging a friendship that had existed longer than she had been alive. The guilt was becoming unbearable. It was in this state of mind that she heard voices coming from the garden below, voices she recognized instantly. She should have announced her presence, should have withdrawn to give them privacy, but something kept her frozen in place, listening to a conversation that would change everything. It was then that she heard voices coming from the garden below, voices she recognized instantly. "This needs to end, Alberto." Edouard was speaking, his voice tense in a way Andy had never heard before. "I cannot continue watching her smile at you the way she smiles. And do you think it is easy for me to see her blush when you enter a room?" Alberto's response carried equal frustration. "But we gave our word, honorable courtship, and let her choose. And if she chooses neither of us, or worse if she cannot choose," Edouard countered. "How long can we continue like this before it destroys us?" There was a long pause before Alberto responded, his voice lower, more serious. "There is a historical precedent, you know, when gentlemen cannot resolve a dispute." "No," Edouard interrupted abruptly. "We are not going down that path." "A duel would resolve this once and for all," Alberto continued, but there was uncertainty in his tone. It would be a definitive solution. Andy felt the blood freeze in her veins. A duel. They were considering a duel. Over her. Her hand flew to cover her mouth, muffling the cry of horror that threatened to escape. "And risk losing you, my brother, in everything but blood, over a woman who may choose neither of us," Edouard said, and there was genuine pain in his voice. "Or worse, that she chooses me but carries the guilt of your death. Or chooses you knowing she took my life." "Then what do you suggest?" Alberto asked. "Because this situation is devouring us from within, old friend." Andy did not wait to hear more. She ran back to the ballroom, her heart beating so hard it seemed everyone could hear it. The idea that those two men, obviously so bound to each other, could be considering resolving their affection for her through violence was absolutely unacceptable. That night, back in her room, Andy made a decision. She could not be the cause of destruction of a friendship that clearly transcended any romantic affection. She could not remain in London knowing that her presence was causing that pain. The next morning, she communicated her decision to her mother. She would visit her aunt in Bath for a season. She needed distance, perspective, time for the two men to reconcile without her presence complicating things. Lady Margaret, perceiving the resolution in her daughter's eyes and understanding more than Andy imagined about the situation, agreed. Sometimes distance was the most compassionate form of love. The letters were sent that afternoon. Brief, polite, explaining that family commitments required her presence in Bath for an indefinite period. Andy did not specify how long, because she honestly did not know. The response came quickly. Flowers, even more elaborate than before, letters pleading that she reconsider. A request from Edouard for a private audience before her departure, propriety observed, but urgency palpable. An invitation from Alberto for one last walk in the park. Andy refused both. She did not trust herself to see them without revealing the true reason for her departure, and she did not want to place upon them the weight of knowing she had heard that devastating conversation. 3 days later, on a foggy morning typical of October, the Whitmore carriage left London. Andy watched the city disappear through the window, silent tears rolling down her face as her mother squeezed her hand in silent support. What Andy did not know was that, at that exact moment, Edward and Alberto found themselves in the library of Ravenswood House, sharing a bottle of exceptionally old Scottish whiskey and confronting the devastating reality that the woman they both loved had just left their lives without giving them a chance for a proper goodbye. "She heard," Edward said finally, his voice hoarse. "Somehow she heard our conversation about the duel." "We cannot know that," Alberto argued, but without conviction. "Can't we?" Edward turned to him, eyes red but dry. "A woman we barely know and who was clearly enjoying our attention simply flees without explanation?" "She heard, Alberto, and she was so horrified that she preferred to leave us both, rather than risk being the cause of violence between us." Alberto deposited his glass with a heavy thud. "Then what does that say about us? That we allowed a competition for affection to almost destroy 25 years of brotherhood?" The silence that followed was heavy with regret and belated understanding. Finally, Edward extended his hand. "I promised that our friendship would survive, regardless of the outcome. I renew that promise now. You are my brother, Alberto. No woman, no matter how extraordinary, is worth losing that." Alberto gripped the hand firmly, but there was sadness in his eyes. "I agree, but Edward, I fear we have both already lost much more than we can admit." Bath received Andy with its characteristic Georgian elegance and its famous thermal waters. Her aunt's house, Lady Beatrice Thornton, was a comfortable residence near the Royal Crescent, and her aunt, a cheerful 50-year-old widow who valued freedom above suffocating conventions, proved to be exactly the company Andy needed. The first few weeks were the hardest. Andy would wake in the mornings having dreamed of stormy grey eyes or warm blue ones, her heart aching with a longing that surprised her with its intensity. She had known both men for such a short time, really. How could their absence create such a profound emptiness? Lady Beatrice watched her niece with knowing eyes but said nothing at first, allowing Andy to process her feelings in her own time. It was only after Andy had been in Bath for 3 weeks, after watching her niece pick at her breakfast yet again, that Beatrice finally intervened. "So, my dear Sobrinha," Aunt Beatrice said during tea one rainy afternoon, using the Portuguese endearment that she had picked up during her travels. "Qual cavaleiro impossível te trouxe à minha porta em fuga dramática?" Andy almost dropped her cup. "Aunt Beatrice, and must you speak in Portuguese? You know my command of the language is limited." "I asked which impossible gentleman brought you to my door in dramatic flight," Aunt Beatrice translated, with a mischievous smile. "And I use Portuguese because sometimes distance in language helps us discuss difficult truths. But very well, we shall speak in English, so? 1 or 2? 2, Andy admitted, defeated, and somehow found herself telling the whole story to her aunt. The ball, the waltzes, the dual courtship, the tension between the friends, the conversation she had heard about duels. Aunt Beatrice listened with growing attention, asking perceptive questions that forced Andy to examine her own feelings more deeply than she had allowed herself until then. Unlike Lady Margaret, who viewed everything through the lens of propriety and social positioning, Beatrice asked about Andy's heart, about what she truly wanted, about who she was when she was with each man. "Edward makes me feel alive," Andy tried to explain. "When he looks at me, I feel seen in a way I never have before. He challenges me, pushes me to think deeply about things I had never questioned. With him, I feel like I could be more than just a proper wife, more than just an ornament in someone's household. He speaks to me of politics and philosophy, asks my opinions, and actually listens to my answers. But he is also intense in a way that sometimes frightens me. I'm not certain I would ever truly know him completely, even if we spent a lifetime together." "And Alberto?" Aunt Beatrice prompted gently. "Alberto makes me feel safe," Andy said, and there were tears in her eyes now. "With him, the world seems brighter, simpler. He is kind in a way that seems effortless, as if generosity and warmth are simply his natural state. When I'm with Alberto, I laugh more easily, breathe more freely. I can imagine a life with him that would be filled with joy and companionship and gentle love, but, her aunt leaned forward. "But I wonder if that would be enough," Andy whispered, voicing a fear she had barely acknowledged to herself. If comfort and kindness would satisfy something in me that craves the intensity Edouard offers, and that makes me feel terrible, like I am ungrateful for Alberto's goodness. "Oh, my dear child," Aunt Beatrice said, reaching across to take Andy's hand. "Love is never simple, and anyone who tells you otherwise has never truly loved. You are not wrong to want intensity any more than you are wrong to want comfort. They are different types of love, and both are valid." "So you love both?" Aunt Beatrice finally asked. "I do not know," Andy responded honestly. "How can I know? I barely know them. But at the same time, I feel as if I have known them a lifetime. Alberto makes my heart joyful. Edouard makes my heart race. But the idea that they could hurt each other for my sake tears me apart." "Then you love them," Aunt Beatrice concluded with satisfaction. "Both in different ways, but genuinely. And more importantly, you love them enough to sacrifice your own happiness for theirs." "Is that not love?" Andy asked, confused. "It is the purest kind of love, dear, but also the kind that can leave you heartbroken and alone." She reached for her niece's hand. "The question is, how long can you carry that weight? Because running away solves their problem, but not yours." Andy had no answer for that. The months in Bath passed with painful slowness. Andy occupied her days walking through the perfectly manicured gardens, attending theatrical performances, taking the waters under protest from Aunt Beatrice, who insisted they would do her melancholic disposition good. She made superficial friendships with other young ladies of Bath society, participated in teas and small social events, but her heart remained firmly trapped in London, divided between two men who had probably already forgotten her. But they had not forgotten her. Unbeknownst to Andy, both Edouard and Alberto wrote letters that they never sent, pouring their hearts onto paper in the privacy of their respective studies. Edouard's letters were intense, passionate declarations that laid bare the depths of his feelings in a way he had never been able to do in person. Alberto's were gentle and hopeful, speaking of futures he dared to imagine and dreams he wanted to share. Neither man sent their letters, each fearing that pursuing Andy after she had so clearly chosen to leave would be a form of selfishness, of placing their own desires above her obvious need for distance and peace. So the letters accumulated in desk drawers, unsent testimonies to love unexpressed. Meanwhile, in London, the friendship between the two men began a slow, painful process of healing. Without Andy's presence as a constant reminder of their rivalry, they found themselves gravitating back toward each other, drawn by decades of shared history and genuine affection. They were not the same as they had been before, the innocence of their friendship having been compromised by competition and jealousy, but they were determined to rebuild what they had nearly lost. It was during one of their tentative reconciliatory dinners, about 6 months after Andy's departure, that they finally spoke openly about what had happened. "I nearly hated you," Edouard admitted, staring into his wineglass. "For weeks after she left, I would see you and feel this surge of anger, this irrational conviction that if you had simply stepped aside, she would have stayed. She would have been mine." "I felt the same," Alberto confessed. "I would lie awake at night imagining all the ways I could have won her if you had not been there, casting your ducal shadow over everything. I resented your title, your wealth, your intensity that seemed to captivate her in ways my simple kindness never could." They sat in silence for a long moment, both contemplating how close they had come to destroying everything. "We were fools," Edouard finally said. "We were men in love," Alberto corrected gently. "And love makes fools of us all. But Edouard, I want you to know if she had chosen you, I would have stepped aside. It would have broken my heart, but I would have done it. Your happiness, her happiness, those would have been more important than my own desires." "I know," Edouard said quietly. "And I would have done the same for you. That is what makes this whole situation so unbearably tragic. We both loved her enough to let her go if it meant she would be happy. We both loved each other enough to sacrifice our own happiness. And in the end, we all lost anyway." "Perhaps," Alberto said thoughtfully, "that is not entirely true. We have reclaimed our friendship. That is something worth having, even if it came at a heavy cost." Letters from Lady Margaret kept Andy apprised of London news. The reports of Edward and Alberto's reconciliation brought her both relief and a strange sort of grief. Relief because she had not permanently destroyed their friendship. Grief because their reconciliation seemed to confirm that neither man loved her enough to continue pursuing her, that she had been a temporary madness that passed once she removed herself from their sight. Letters from her mother brought news from London. Gentlemen Ashford and Sinclair, Lady Margaret reported, seemed to have resumed their characteristic friendship. They were seen together at the clubs, at the opera, at social events, apparently without any residual tension. Neither showed particular interest in other available young ladies, but they also did not mention Andy. Each letter that did not mention her was simultaneously relief and agony for Andy. Relief because it meant she had not caused permanent damage between the friends. Agony because it meant she had not been as significant as she had imagined. It was on a cold March morning, almost 10 months after her arrival in Bath, that the letter arrived. Andy recognized her mother's handwriting on the envelope, but there was something different in the weight of the paper, in the evident haste of the calligraphy. Her hands trembled when she opened it. "My dearest Andrea, it is with a heavy heart that I must communicate devastating news. Mr. Alberto Sinclair passed away 3 days ago, scarlet fever, according to the doctors. The disease struck him with terrible speed, and despite all efforts, he was gone within days. The funeral will be next Tuesday, but I do not expect you to return in time. The journey is long, and I consider it imprudent for you to expose yourself to London while the disease may still be circulating. The Duke of Ravenswood is, by all accounts, completely devastated. They say he has not left Alberto's family home since the death, and that he personally organized every detail of the funeral. I cannot imagine the pain of losing someone who was truly a brother to him. I know this news will affect you deeply, my dear. Take the time you need before deciding whether to return. Your safety is my primary concern. With all my love, Mother." The letter fell from Andy's trembling hands. Alberto. Dead. The cheerful, kind, radiant Alberto, who had made her laugh so easily, who had looked at her with those crystalline blue eyes full of warmth and promise. Gone, in a matter of days. And Edward. Edward, who had lost his brother, in everything but blood. Edward, who was now alone, drowning in grief that she could not even begin to imagine. The guilt hit her like a physical blow. She had left. She had run away to protect them from each other, and in her absence, fate had dealt a blow far more cruel than anything they could have done to each other. If she had stayed, if she had been there, could she have made Alberto's final days brighter? Could she have comforted Edward in his grief? "No," she whispered to the empty room. "No, no, no." Aunt Beatrice found her hours later, still sitting with the letter clutched in her hands, tears having long since dried on her cheeks, leaving only a hollow emptiness. "I need to go back," Andy said, her voice distant. "I need to go back to London." "The funeral will be over before you arrive," Aunt Beatrice said gently, having already read the letter Andy had dropped. "I know, but I need to go back anyway. Edward, he must be—" She could not finish the sentence. "He must be drowning," Aunt Beatrice finished for her, "and you feel responsible." "I left them," Andy said, and the words tasted like ash. "I ran away because I was afraid of what might happen, and now this. I should have been there." "My dear child, you cannot blame yourself for an illness. Scarlet fever is indiscriminate and cruel. Your presence would not have prevented it. But I could have been there for them, for both of them. Instead, I was here, safe and comfortable, while they—" She stood abruptly. "I am returning to London tomorrow, if possible." Aunt Beatrice studied her niece's face, seeing there a determination that had not existed 10 months ago. Andy had left London a romantic girl, fleeing from the complications of the heart. She was preparing to return a woman ready to face the consequences of her choices. "Then I will arrange the journey," Aunt Beatrice said. "But Andrea, prepare yourself. The man you return to will not be the man you left. Grief changes people in fundamental ways." 1 week later, Andy's carriage rolled through the familiar streets of London. The city seemed different, or perhaps she was the one who had changed. Everything appeared slightly grey, muted, as if the world itself was in mourning. Or perhaps it was simply her own grief colouring her perception, painting everything in shades of sorrow. The journey from Bath had been long and uncomfortable, but Andy had barely noticed the physical discomfort, her mind too occupied with memories of Alberto and worries about Edward. She had replayed every conversation, every smile, every moment she had spent with both men, torturing herself with questions that could never be answered. Had Alberto known she cared for him? Had he died thinking she had simply abandoned him without a thought? And Edward, how was he surviving this devastating loss? Lady Margaret was waiting at the door when Andy arrived, and mother and daughter embraced silently for a long moment. Andy could feel her mother trembling slightly, and realized that Lady Margaret too had been affected by Alberto's death. He had been kind to everyone, had charmed Lady Margaret during his courtship of Andy, with his genuine interest in her opinions and his respect for her guidance. "The funeral was 3 days ago," Lady Margaret finally said as they entered the house, her voice heavy with sadness. "It was, Andrea, I have never witnessed such grief. The church was packed, every pew filled with people whose lives Alberto had touched in some way. Lord Pemberton could barely stand. His wife had to be supported by 2 of their daughters. But Edward," she paused, as if gathering strength to continue. "Edward gave a eulogy that left not a single dry eye in the church. He spoke of brotherhood, of loyalty, of a bond that death itself could not sever. He talked about their childhood adventures, their years at school together, the countless ways Alberto had made his life better simply by being in it. And then he spoke about Alberto's final hours, about the forgiveness and love they had shared, about Alberto's concern, even in death, that Edward should not blame himself for anything." Lady Margaret's voice broke, and Andy held her mother's hand tightly. He said that Alberto's final coherent words were a blessing, a wish that Edward should find happiness and live fully, that he should love without reservation and forgive himself for being human. By the time Edward finished speaking, half the congregation was openly weeping. "How is he now?" Andy asked, though she almost feared the answer. "No one has seen him since the funeral. He returned to Ravenswood House and has not emerged. His staff says he has locked himself in the library and refuses all visitors. Several of his closest friends have tried to call on him, but he sends them away. Even Lord Pemberton, who surely needs Edward's support as much as Edward needs his, has been turned away." Lady Margaret looked at her daughter with worry etched into every line of her face. "Andy, perhaps you should wait a few days before attempting to see him. Give him time to—" "To what?" Andy interrupted gently but firmly. "To drown alone in his grief, to torture himself with guilt and regret. No, Mother, I have already waited too long. I have already run from things that frightened me. Not this time. Not when someone I care about is suffering." There was steel in Andy's voice that Lady Margaret had never heard before, a determination that spoke to fundamental changes wrought by 10 months of exile and the shock of devastating news. Her daughter had left London a girl. She was returning a woman. "Very well," Lady Margaret conceded. "But take care, my dear. Grief can make people say and do things they do not mean. If he lashes out at you, if he blames you in some way for his pain, remember that it is the grief speaking, not the man you knew." "I understand," Andy said, though she prayed that Edward would not reject her when she most wanted to help him. The next morning, Andy found herself standing before the imposing doors of Ravenswood House. The butler who answered her knock looked exhausted, dark circles under his eyes, suggesting sleepless nights. "Miss Whitmore," he said, recognition and something like relief crossing his features. His Grace has been refusing all visitors." "I understand," Andy said quietly, "but I need to see him. Please, just tell him I'm here. If he truly does not wish to see me, I will leave." The butler hesitated, then nodded. "Wait here, miss." He returned minutes later, his expression unreadable. "His Grace will see you." In the library, Andy followed him through corridors that seemed dimmer than she remembered, as if the house itself was grieving. The butler opened the library door and quietly withdrew, closing it behind her. The room was in shadow, curtains drawn against the afternoon sun. A fire burned low in the fireplace, providing the only light, and there, in a chair facing the flames, sat Edward. He did not turn when she entered. For a long moment, Andy simply stood there taking in the changes that a week of grief had wrought. His hair was disheveled, his clothes rumpled as if he had slept in them. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse from disuse. "You came back." "I came back," Andy confirmed, moving closer but maintaining a respectful distance. "I am so sorry, Edward. I am so very sorry." "Sorry." He repeated the word as if tasting it. "Everyone is sorry." As if their sorrow could bring him back. As if their words could fill the emptiness he left behind. "Nothing can fill that emptiness," Andy said softly. "Nothing and no one. Alberto was irreplaceable." Finally, Edward turned to look at her, and Andy barely suppressed a gasp. His grey eyes, usually so intense and alive, were hollow. The grief there was so profound it was almost physical. "You left," he said, and there was no accusation in his tone, only a statement of fact. 10 months ago you left without a word of explanation." "I heard you," Andy confessed, deciding that lies and evasions had no place here. "That night at the Hartford musical, I heard you and Alberto discussing a duel. I could not bear to be the cause of that, so I left." Something flickered in Edward's eyes. A duel? God, that seems like a lifetime ago. Alberto and I fighting over a woman like fools, never realizing that time. His voice broke. "Time is never guaranteed. We wasted so much of it on jealousy and competition when we should have been living," Andy finished for him. "Loving, being the brothers you always were." "He forgave me," Edward said suddenly, urgently. "In those final hours, when the fever had him and he could barely speak, he took my hand and he forgave me. For the tension, for the competition, for all of it. His last coherent words were, 'Love her for both of us.'" Tears streamed down Andy's face. "Edward." "But how can I?" Edward stood abruptly, pacing like a caged animal. "How can I pursue my own happiness knowing it cost him his life?" "It did not cost him his life," Andy said firmly, moving to stand in his path, forcing him to stop. "Scarlet fever cost him his life. A cruel, indiscriminate disease that cares nothing for love or friendship or any human concern. You are not responsible for this, Edward. Neither am I. Neither of us could have prevented this tragedy. But we caused him pain in his final months," Edward said, and his voice was raw with anguish. "Because of our competition, because of our inability to simply step aside, we made his last days on this earth ones of conflict and tension." "No," Andy said, and there was steel in her voice. "You gave him months of joy. He was fighting for something he wanted, competing with someone he loved like a brother, and he was happy doing it. Alberto was not a fragile man who needed protecting from life. He was vibrant and alive and choosing to pursue what he wanted. Do not dishonor his memory by reducing those months to nothing but pain." Edward stared at her, and slowly something shifted in his expression. "When did you become so wise?" "When I spent 10 months running from the truth," Andy replied. "Running from the fact that I loved you both, differently but genuinely. Running from the impossible choice between you. And then fate made the choice for me, in the cruelest way possible." "You loved us both," Edward repeated, and it was not a question. "I did. I do." Andy reached out, taking his hand. "I loved Alberto's light, his joy, the way he made the world seem brighter, and I loved your intensity, your passion, the way you made me feel truly seen. Loving one did not diminish the other. They were different loves, but both were real." Edward looked down at their joined hands. "He told me to love you for both of us, but I do not know if I can. I do not know if I deserve to after—" "Stop," Andy interrupted. "Edward, look at me." She waited until his eyes met hers. "Alberto loved you. That love did not die with him. It does not require punishment or penance. It requires that you honor it by living, by allowing yourself to continue feeling, to continue hoping, to eventually find joy again. That is what he would want." "How can you know that?" "Because that is what anyone who truly loves wants for those they leave behind," Andy said simply. "Not eternal mourning, but eventual peace. Not a life of guilt, but a life well lived in their memory. For the first time since she had entered the room, Edward's eyes filled with tears. He pulled Andy into his arms, holding her as if she were an anchor in a stormy sea, and wept. She held him, offering no platitudes or false comforts, just her presence and her understanding. They stood like that for a long time, two people bound together by loss and love, and the ghost of a man who had loved them both. In the days and weeks that followed, Andy became a regular visitor to Ravenswood House. She did not push, did not demand, simply sat with Edward as he slowly found his way back to life. They talked about Alberto, sharing memories and stories, laughing at his terrible jokes and his infectious optimism, crying when the weight of his absence became too heavy to bear alone. Slowly, imperceptibly at first, something began to shift between them. The intensity that had characterized their first meeting was still there, but it had been tempered by grief and understanding into something deeper, more profound. They were no longer two people competing for the same prize, but two souls bound by shared loss, and the gradual realization that life, however painful, continued forward. It was a warm afternoon in late May, nearly 3 months after Alberto's death, when Edward asked Andy to walk with him in the gardens of Ravenswood House. The roses were in full bloom, their fragrance heavy in the air, and for the first time in months, Edward seemed almost like his old self. "I have been thinking," he began, his hands clasped behind his back as they walked along the gravel path, "about what Alberto said, about loving you for both of us." Andy said nothing, simply waited for him to continue. "I do not think he meant that I should love you as he would have loved you," Edward continued. "I think he meant that I should love you fully, completely, holding nothing back, that I should embrace whatever happiness we might find together, not in spite of his absence, but in honor of the friendship that allowed us to be so open with each other in the first place." He stopped walking and turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. "Andrea Whitmore, I loved you from the moment I saw you across that ballroom. That has not changed. If anything, these months of grief have shown me how precious and fleeting life can be. I do not want to waste another moment in uncertainty or guilt." Andy's heart raced, but she needed to be certain. "And Alberto? Will his memory always stand between us?" "No," Edward said firmly. "His memory will stand beside us. It will be part of our foundation, a reminder of the cost of wasted time and the value of honest love. I want to build a life with you, Andy. A life that honors what we have lost while celebrating what we have found." Tears gathered in Andy's eyes, but they were not tears of sorrow alone. "I want that too," she whispered. "I have wanted it for so long, but I was afraid." "We have both been afraid," Edward said, reaching up to cup her face gently. "But I think it is time to be brave." He kissed her then, gently at first, then with growing passion, and Andy felt as if pieces of herself that had been scattered were finally coming back together. It was not the desperate, all-consuming fire she had imagined in her youth. It was something better, something deeper. It was love tempered by loss, passion grounded in understanding, hope built on the foundation of shared grief. When they finally pulled apart, both were smiling through their tears. "I have something to ask you," Edward said, his voice slightly unsteady. "But first, there is something I must do." He led her to a corner of the garden where a young oak tree had recently been planted. At its base was a simple stone marker. "In memory of Alberto Sinclair," Andy read aloud. "Brother, friend, forever missed." "I planted it the week after the funeral," Edward explained. "A living memorial, something that will grow and strengthen with time, just as our memories of him should. I come here often, to talk to him, to ask his advice, to simply feel close to him again." He knelt beside the marker, and Andy knelt with him. "Alberto," Edward said softly, "I am about to ask the woman we both love to be my wife. I hope, wherever you are, you can forgive me for finding happiness in your absence. But more than that, I hope you know that you will never be forgotten, that your name will be spoken in my house, that your memory will be honored, that any children I have will know the story of the uncle they never met, but who changed their father's life forever." Andy felt fresh tears spill down her cheeks as Edward turned to her, pulling a small velvet box from his pocket. Andrea Whitmore, will you marry me? Will you build a life with me, one that remembers the past while embracing the future? Will you help me become the man that Alberto believed I could be? Yes, Andy breathed, not hesitating for even a moment. Yes, Edward. 1,000 times, yes. He slipped the ring onto her finger, a beautiful sapphire surrounded by diamonds that caught the afternoon light. Then he pulled her close, and they held each other beside Alberto's tree, two people who had found love in the most unexpected and painful of circumstances. Their engagement was announced quietly, without the fanfare that would typically accompany the betrothal of a duke. The wedding was planned for August, a small ceremony with only close family and friends. Lady Margaret wept happy tears when Andy told her, embracing her daughter and whispering that she was proud of the woman she had become. The night before the wedding, Andy found herself unable to sleep. She sat in her room at her mother's house, looking at the wedding dress hanging by the window, thinking about the journey that had brought her to this moment. The girl who had entered that ballroom 15 months ago seemed like a stranger now, innocent and naive, believing that love was simple and that happy endings came without cost. She knew better now. She knew that love was complicated, that happiness was often built on the foundation of sorrow, that every joy carried within it the echo of loss, but she also knew that this made it more precious, not less. That the ability to love again after grief was perhaps the greatest act of courage a human could perform. There was a soft knock at her door, and Lady Margaret entered, carrying something wrapped in cloth. "I thought you might be awake," her mother said, sitting beside her on the bed. "I have something for you." She unwrapped the cloth to reveal a small wooden box. Inside was a pressed flower, white and delicate, one of the flowers that had been in Andy's hair the night of that first ball. "Alberto sent these to me the day before he became ill," Lady Margaret said softly, "with a letter asking that I save one in case things did not end as he hoped. He wanted you to have it on your wedding day, whomever you married, with his blessing and his love." Andy took the pressed flower with trembling hands. "He knew," she whispered. "He knew he might not." "He knew that life is uncertain," Lady Margaret corrected gently. "And he wanted to ensure that his love for you, in whatever form it took, would be part of your happiness. That is the kind of man he was." Andy carefully placed the flower in her wedding bouquet, where it would rest among the white roses and lilies. Tomorrow, when she walked down the aisle to marry Edward, Alberto would be with her in spirit, his blessing woven into the flowers she carried. The wedding day dawned clear and bright, unusually warm for August. The ceremony was held in the small chapel on the Ravenswood estate, the same chapel where Alberto's funeral had been held 3 months earlier. It was a deliberate choice, Edward had explained. He wanted to reclaim that space, to fill it with joy and promise instead of leaving it forever, associated only with grief. As Andy walked down the aisle on her father's arm, she saw Edward waiting at the altar, looking impossibly handsome in his formal attire, his eyes locked on hers with an intensity that still made her breath catch. But standing beside him, in her mind's eye, she could see Alberto too, smiling that radiant smile, giving them both his blessing. The ceremony was beautiful in its simplicity. There were no grand speeches, no elaborate rituals, just two people promising to love and honor each other for whatever time they were given, to face life's uncertainties together, to build something meaningful on the foundation of shared grief and hard-won wisdom. When the vicar pronounced them husband and wife, and Edward kissed her with gentle reverence, Andy felt a sense of peace settle over her. This was not the fairy tale ending she had imagined as a girl. It was something better, something real. It was love that had survived loss, joy that acknowledged sorrow, hope that was grounded in the reality of life's fragility. The wedding breakfast was intimate and warm, filled with laughter and gentle tears. Edward gave a toast that spoke of second chances and the importance of seizing happiness when it was offered. He raised his glass to Alberto, thanking him for the gift of his friendship and his final blessing, and there was not a dry eye in the room. As the celebration wound down and guests began to depart, Edward took Andy's hand and led her once more to Alberto's tree in the garden. It had grown noticeably in the month since it had been planted, its leaves full and green, reaching toward the sky. "I wanted to bring you here before we leave for our wedding trip," Edward said, "to show you something." He gestured to a new addition beside the marker, a small bench carved from oak with an inscription, "Rest here and remember love." "I had it made so that we can come here together," Edward explained, "so that our children, when we have them, can sit here and learn about the uncle who will never hold them, but whose love helped bring them into existence, so that Alberto remains part of our story always." Andy wrapped her arms around her husband, overwhelmed by the thoughtfulness of the gesture. "It is perfect," she whispered. "He would have loved it." They sat together on the bench as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. And in that moment, Andy felt a presence beside them, warm and comforting and achingly familiar. She could not say if it was real or imagined, faith or fancy, but she chose to believe that Alberto was there with them, happy in their happiness, at peace with the way things had unfolded. "Thank you," she whispered to the air, to the tree, to the memory of a man who had loved her enough to let her go. "Thank you for everything." The years that followed were not without their challenges. Edward struggled periodically with guilt and grief, wondering if he deserved the happiness he had found. Andy had moments when she looked at her husband and saw the ghost of his best friend standing beside him, a reminder of the path not taken, the love not fulfilled. But they worked through these moments together, talking openly, supporting each other, building a partnership that was stronger for having weathered loss. 18 months after their wedding, Andy gave birth to a son. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Edward feared he might lose her, that fate would again show its cruel hand and take from him another person he loved beyond measure. But Andy was strong, stronger than anyone had given her credit for, and she brought their child into the world with fierce determination. When Edward held his son for the first time, tears streaming down his face, Andy watched the transformation that came over her husband. All the grief and guilt that had shadowed him seemed to lift, replaced by wonder and hope and overwhelming love. "What shall we name him?" Edward asked, unable to take his eyes off the tiny face. Andy smiled, though her eyes too were wet with tears. "I think you know." Edward looked up at her, understanding dawning in his expression. "Are you certain?" "I am certain," Andy said firmly. "We will call him Alberto Edward Ashford." Alberto, so that he carries with him always the name of a man who loved without condition, who gave his blessing even in death. And Edward, so that he knows the strength and honor of his father. Edward bent to kiss his wife, his son cradled carefully between them. "You are the most remarkable woman I have ever known," he whispered. "And you are the man I was always meant to find," Andy replied. "It just took loss and grief and a long journey to bring us together." Little Alberto, or Albie as he quickly became known, grew into a bright and cheerful child who seemed to have inherited the best of both the men for whom he was named. He had his father's intelligence and intensity, but also a natural warmth and charm that reminded everyone who had known him of his namesake. Edward told him stories about his uncle from the time he was old enough to understand, painting a picture of a man who was brave and kind, loyal and joyful. On Albie's 4th birthday, the family made a pilgrimage to Alberto's tree, which had grown tall and strong. Albie laid flowers at the base of the marker, as he did every year on his birthday and on the anniversary of Alberto's death. "Is Uncle Alberto watching us from heaven?" Albie asked, his small hand in his father's. Edward knelt beside his son, smoothing back his dark hair. "I believe he is," he said. "I believe he sees how loved you are, how happy you make us, and how his name lives on in you. And I believe he is smiling." "I wish I could have met him," Albie said wistfully. "So do I, my son," Edward replied, his voice thick with emotion. "But in a way you carry him with you always. Every time someone speaks your name, they remember him. Every time you show kindness or courage or joy, you honor his memory. That is a precious gift." Andy watched her husband and son together, feeling a swell of love so profound it was almost painful. They had built something beautiful from the ashes of loss, a family grounded in memory, but reaching always toward the future. It was not the life she had imagined in her youth, but it was infinitely more precious for having been earned through grief and sacrifice. As the years continued to pass, the sharp edge of grief dulled into a gentle melancholy, a bittersweet awareness of absence that no longer crippled, but instead informed their appreciation for what they had. Edward became known not just as a powerful duke, but as a devoted husband and father, a man who had learned through loss the true value of love. Andy blossomed into a woman of substance and compassion, known for her work with widows and orphans, her understanding of grief making her a comfort to others who walked that difficult path. They had 2 more children, a daughter named Margaret after Andy's mother, and another son they called James. But Alberto remained the eldest, the keeper of his uncle's name, the living bridge between past and present. He grew into a fine young man, with his father's sense of honor and his mother's kind heart, and a joy in life that seemed to come from somewhere beyond himself. On the 20th anniversary of Alberto Sinclair's death, the family gathered once more at his tree, which had grown into a magnificent oak, its branches spreading wide to provide shade and shelter. Albie, now a young man of 18, had brought his own contribution to the memorial, a small plaque he had commissioned. "Here lies not just a man, but a bridge between hearts," it read. "Alberto Sinclair, whose love in life and blessing in death made possible the family gathered here. Forever in our hearts, forever in our story." As they unveiled the plaque together, Andy felt Edward's arm around her waist, felt her children pressed close, and thought about the strange and winding path that had brought them all to this moment. A chance meeting at a ball, 2 men who loved the same woman, a friendship tested and ultimately proven stronger than death, and a love that had grown from the soil of grief into something lasting and true. "Do you think he would be pleased?" Edward asked quietly. His question meant only for her. Andy looked at their children, at the tree that had grown so strong, at the life they had built together. "I think he would be more than pleased," she said. "I think he would be honored. And I think wherever he is, he knows that his sacrifice, his final gift to both of us, was not in vain." That night, in their bedchamber, Edward held Andy close as they had done for nearly 20 years, their bodies fitting together with the ease of long familiarity. "Do you ever wonder," Edward asked into the darkness, "what would have happened if he had lived, if fate had not intervened?" Andy was quiet for a long moment, considering. "I used to," she admitted. "In those early days I tortured myself with it, but now I think I understand that there are no answers to such questions. We cannot know what might have been, only what is. And what is, Edward, is a life rich with love and memory, pain and joy all woven together." "You are wise, my love," Edward murmured, pressing a kiss to her temple. "I am simply a woman who has learned that life rarely follows the path we imagine for it," Andy replied. "But that does not make the journey less precious. Perhaps it makes it more so." As she drifted towards sleep, safe in her husband's arms, Andy thought she felt a gentle presence in the room, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire in the hearth. She smiled into the darkness, sending a silent message to the man whose love had shaped her life in ways she could never have imagined. "Thank you, Alberto. Thank you for loving us enough to let us love each other. Thank you for your blessing, your sacrifice, your enduring presence in our lives. You are not forgotten. You will never be forgotten." And in the whisper of the wind through the trees outside, in the gentle settling of the house around them, she could almost hear his response. A laugh full of joy, a blessing freely given, and the assurance that love, true love, never truly dies, but transforms and continues in ways both seen and unseen. The story of the Duke of Ravenswood and Andrea Whitmore was told in drawing rooms across London for decades to come. Some versions emphasized the romance, the dramatic courtship and eventual happy union. Others focused on the tragedy, the death of Alberto Sinclair and the grief that had nearly destroyed his best friend. But those who truly knew the family, who saw the love that bound them, and the reverence with which they honored the past while embracing the future, understood that it was not a story of romance or tragedy alone. It was a story about the complexity of love, about the courage required to live fully in the face of loss, about friendship that transcended death, and about the unexpected paths that lead us to our destiny. It was a story about 3 people whose lives had intersected for too brief a time, but whose love for each other, in all its varied forms, had created something that endured far beyond the limitations of mortal life. And in the garden of Ravenswood House, under the spreading branches of Alberto's oak, that story continued to unfold with each new generation, a living testament to the truth that love, once given, never truly ends, but ripples outward through time, touching lives and shaping destinies in ways both mysterious and profound. Years turned into decades, and Edward and Andy grew old together, their love deepening with each passing season. They watched their children grow and marry and have children of their own, each generation learning the story of the uncle whose name the eldest had carried, whose memory had shaped their family's understanding of love and loss. On their 50th wedding anniversary, surrounded by children and grandchildren, Edward raised a glass in the garden beside Alberto's tree, now ancient and majestic. "To Alberto," he said, his voice still strong despite his years, "who taught me that true friendship knows no bounds, that love can take many forms, and that the greatest gift we can give those we love is the freedom to find happiness, even in our absence. Everything good in my life flows from that final lesson." "To Alberto," the family echoed, raising their glasses to the tree, to the memory, to the love that had made them all possible. And as the sun set over Ravenswood House, painting the sky in brilliant shades of gold and crimson, it seemed to Andy that she could see, just for a moment, a familiar figure standing beneath the tree, his face alight with that radiant smile, his hand raised in a final eternal blessing. The end. Thank you for staying with us until the end of this emotional journey. If this story touched your heart, we invite you to subscribe, like, comment, and share our channel. Your support inspires us to keep creating more stories of love, redemption, and breathtaking twists. Help us reach our first 1,000 subscribers, and together we'll continue sharing tales that warm the heart. At the end of this video, you'll see a suggestion for another of our historical stories. Click and let yourself be enchanted by another unforgettable tale. With all our gratitude, Echoes of Romance.